It's not the things you don't know that get you into trouble. It's the things you know for sure that just ain't so. I don't know about you, but that kind of sounds to me like Mark Twain was talking about vendor management. We all think we have our third parties, we understand who they all are, we have them under control, but then before you know it, we get into trouble. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm Kyle Hinterberg. I'm a QSA senior manager with LBMC. I've had the opportunity to work in PCI now, both internally at merchant organizations as well as externally as a consultant for over 10 years.
And I'm Brian Willis, partner with LBMC. I've been a QSA since about 2009. I also direct our ISO 27001 certification practice.
And so like I was saying, we have this thought, compliant third parties, they equal a secure ecosystem. As long as we have them, we're safe and we're secure. But that really isn't the case. Just because we have compliant third parties doesn't necessarily mean we're automatically going to be safe and secure. It could very well be some of those fourth parties and fifth parties that we're not considering today that could come back to bite us. And just to, kind of talk through it, give an example, if we jump back in time to 2023, the largest data theft of the year that occurred was due to a file transfer solution. There was a popular file transfer solution. Many organizations used it. It's a fine solution, but unfortunately it was attacked. Some hackers were able to use some SQL injection, got into that solution, and started to get remote code execution, and then leverage that to start exfiltrating data. And so they were stealing the files that were being transferred through this file transfer solution. And it's surmised that approximately over 2,000 organizations were affected, with over 95 million individuals affected. But the scariest part to me is that the odds are, out of those 2,000 organizations, the majority of them had no idea that their data was potentially being stolen. There was probably security analysts that were seeing this breach in the news, reading about it, and thinking, well, that sucks for them, without realizing that was their data that was being stolen because it was a fourth party. And for how that can happen, we can look at a few examples. There were multiple UK organizations. They all used a third-party payroll provider. That third-party payroll provider used this file transfer solution. And so their data was stolen, and approximately 34,000 staff had their data compromised. There was over 900 U.S. higher ed institutions, colleges and universities, and they relied on a student data service. And that service used the third-party file transfer solution. And so approximately 270,000 students had their data compromised. Another example, there was a large U.S. retirement and insurance provider, and they relied on a research service, thinking that it's all well and good, and I'm sure it was. This is nothing against any of these organizations, but that service relied on the file transfer solution, and again, their data got exfiltrated, and over 371,000 individuals potentially had their data compromised. And this isn't, again, to pick on any of these organizations, it's just that we need to be aware of it. You think about 900 colleges and universities are all relying on the service. Odds are that means it's the service to use. Everyone is using it, but even there, they're relying on fourth parties, fifth parties that could potentially impact your data. And obviously for us today here, we're mostly focused on PCI. And so to dial it back and look at what does the PCI DSS have to say about third-party, fourth-party vendor management. Obviously, the big one is always going to be 12.8. That really covers everything, third-party, TPSP, third-party service provider related. But you can see it mentioned in other places. One of the big hot topics still is 643. And if you read the applicability notes in there, it'll call out that 643 applies to third-party script as well as fourth-party scripts. So if you have fourth-party scripts on your payment pages, you still need to address 643 as far as they're concerned. FAQ 1588 does clarify that a little bit. If you have third or fourth parties that are providing scripts to your website, but they're not payment page scripts, they're not affecting cardholder data, can't affect cardholder data, that alone doesn't necessarily qualify them to be a third-party service provider or even a fourth-party service provider from a PCI perspective. And lastly, we have the information supplement on third-party security assurance. If you haven't read this, you really should. This is an excellent document. You know, as the council's been saying all day, they've, this year released many guidance documents. I think all of them are excellent. This is a little bit older. It wasn't obviously released this year, but all of the guidance documents are things we should all be reading. And in here, you'll notice it talks about nested TPSPs, nested third-party service providers. And those are essentially your fourth-party service providers, your service providers' service providers. And you'll notice there on the bottom, it calls out that it highly recommends that you have oversight of those nested service providers, but the DSS by default just requires you to maintain oversight of your contracted third parties, those third-party service providers. And so with that being said, we'll let Brian dig into how we can use 12.8 to help us maintain compliance for our third parties as well as those fourth and fifth parties.
Thank you, Kyle. So we begin with 12.8.1 and maintaining a list of your third-party service providers. Now, again, the standard isn't really prescriptive on the list. In fact, we think that it should be more than just a list. We think of a list, we think of just a list of names of service providers. And really think of this more as a registry. Think of a registry, you're capturing more details than just names. So it should be something like a spreadsheet, a database tool, or something like that, where you're capturing all of your vendors, your third-party service providers who store, process, or transmit cardholder data, who manage CDE system components. So think of this like your cloud hosting providers, cloud components to your SIM or your anti-malware solutions, and then security impacting. These are your managed security services, software development, other third parties, and nested parties that are impacting the security of your cardholder data environment. Be sure to research and document vendors listed in their attestations. So again, when you're getting the attestations for your direct third-party service providers, remember there's the section in the attestation that lists their service providers as well, and you should be keeping these in your registry and tracking those vendors. And of course, the main subject of our talk, and we'll get into some more details about that as we go along. Review those Nth-Party attestations. So you're either going to use the Visa or the MasterCard registries that are accessible to you. Check their websites, do your own digging, do your own background checking, as it were, against these other Nth-Party providers. All of this in support of 12.8.4, which we'll look at here shortly. 12.8.5 says it's responsibility of the primary third-party service provider to manage, monitor their providers, but entities can do this too. There's nothing preventing you, prohibiting you, restricting you from doing that research and including these nested providers in your own listing or registry. 12.8.2 written agreements. This can be one of the more challenging things to maintain, to monitor, and then even for QSAs to assess. But the idea here is to review your service agreements prior to signing on. You want to be sure what you're getting into, making sure that the agreements cover the services that you're utilizing and that give you the ability to assess and understand the risk that you may be inheriting using them. We recommend involving internal and external legal counsel. And again, this isn't just to hack up the agreement to suit your will. At least the idea is to give you advice, give you counsel so that you have a proper understanding of, like I say, what you're getting into with the agreement. Make sure that you have an understanding of limitations or risk that may be inherent with the service. Check if nested service providers are in the agreement. Maybe not naming them specifically, but at least some kind of reference in the agreement where they're accepting responsibility or acknowledging responsibility that they may be using service providers as part of the service they're delivering to you. Now, the DSS only requires acknowledgement that the service providers are responsible for the security of account data. So again, within agreements, and I was just taking the recall exam this weekend, Kyle, and there was actually a question around this. And even in the question, it pointed out that the agreements just have to reflect, or they may be different based on the nature of the service and the relationship between an entity and their service provider. So as I say, it can be difficult to assess just simply because the content can be varied. But the point is that the agreement is again acknowledging responsibility. Service providers must have the agreement as part of 12.9.1. You might want to consider making this a condition of the service that you're engaging them for. 12.83 about due diligence. So again, we kind of talked about this earlier, but this is really you doing the background check on your provider, making sure that they're doing everything, or you understand everything that they're doing for you and how they're acknowledging that. This should be plugged into your vendor management program. So there's no reason for security and compliance folks not to be involved as part of the corporate or organizational vendor vetting program. And particularly, you want to be reviewing all vendors, not just the ones that are directly involved with your payment processes, because you never know how these vendors may impact it. I think the examples that Kyle was sharing, there were several in there where probably they're not being engaged necessarily for a payment operation, but because of the nature of their service, they still had an impact in the environment. So make sure you're reviewing all of your vendors. Consider the ability to monitor related requirements, such as 6.3.1, which is what? Anybody? I think I heard it over there. Vulnerability management. So again, you want to make sure that all of these vendors, as you're engaging them, that as part of their service, whether it's a condition or service or just the nature of the service, you'll be able to do things like vulnerability management, scans, other types of testing. Review their vendor websites. So it's a good idea to read their websites. Make sure are there acknowledgments about compliance there or security. Review their attestations, look for any press releases, anything that may give you a good indicator of, one, not only, again, this all extends not only to the direct service providers you're engaging, but also these nested service providers as well. Consider vendor monitoring services. Plenty of them out there now that can monitor, that are monitoring for security incidents, reputation, things like that, can give you some good insight into your service providers, and again, their service providers and any risk they may be introducing. And then ask your network. I think one of the great things that the council continually emphasizes about the value of the community meeting is the collaboration, the ability for each of us to meet with our peers and engage not just in the conference, but in the years between the conference, asking your network, reaching out. Hey, do you use this service provider? What about their service providers? Any thing you would guide us? Any advice you would give us? Great way to understand the various layers of service providers you're engaging. Compliance monitoring, so this really is the ongoing monitoring. So even though the standard says to review annually, which define, of course, at least once every 365 days, great advice, but I don't think there's any of us that wouldn't want to have really a continual monitoring process for our service providers, particularly because many of them, their attestations come out at different points throughout the year, so you want to be monitoring continually to make sure that those attestations, other documents and things and agreements that are being renewed, that you're monitoring those continually. Solicit attestations. Be wary of significant delays. Now, we can, as QSAs, attest that that oftentimes you get to the end of an assessment, and those, finalizing the report and getting things delivered, that can go on a little bit past the ROC date. So good to have a little bit of grace and patience there as we kind of wrap that process up. But once that extends out to several weeks or a couple months, you need to be following up with your service providers to make sure that those things are on their way. Again, review the various registries for, again, the primary nested vendors. Continually renew those. In your registry, you should be recording all of those ROC dates, attestation dates, so that when that date comes up, you can kind of be watching the registries or looking for them to publish or provide to you attestations. Remember, the registries update monthly, so if a ROC expired this week, it may be about a month from now before the registries are updated and reflect those updates. So again, might have to have a little patience there. Review your attestations against the agreements that you have to make sure that everything aligns there. If the agreement said something about an annual ROC and now you're getting an unattested SAQ, you might have some issues there to address. Validate the attestation covers your services, and remember to look in both the services and the services covered by the attestation and those not covered by the attestation to make sure, again, for your service providers, your nested service providers, that what they're utilizing is addressed in there. And then have your QSA review. We're always available to you. Your QSA should be willing and available to you to help you with the review process to make sure everything aligns, that you're aware of any risk or potential issues that are seen there. We talked a little bit earlier about a compliance registry, and what you see on the screen, this is just an example of a responsibility matrix that we've worked up. It's a good way of, again, accounting for who's responsible for what. And again, I would commend the council for, within version 4 of the standard, introducing section 12.9, putting the onus for delivering, one, agreements as well as the responsibility documentation to their customers. I think it's a great way to enforce that. If you were at the assessor session yesterday, you heard that it's still not commonly done. There's still some struggle with getting that information out of service providers, but at least you have some leverage to get that information and hold them to account. So again, good practices here, keep your responsibility matrix. This is a section in which, in 12.8.5, where the council does mention nested service providers, enforcing that these requirements do apply to those different layers of service providers. Now, what about non-attested third-party service providers? They are out there, and you may have already engaged them. They still must be monitored for compliance, and the standard itself mentions, providing sufficient evidence, specific evidence, undergoing multiple on-demand assessments. We have some clients that we, as a part of our client's assessment, we get a meeting together with their service providers, and we're asking them a question, the questions around how do you manage vulnerabilities, how do you control access, and so forth. So it is proper to do. It is expected to do. It should be worked out as part of your agreement. So if you know ahead of time that this particular service provider does not go through annual attestation, you're going to have to engage them once a year as part of your assessment. So you want to make sure that you've worked that out as the agreement so there's no surprises, because it is not easy to request that after the fact. Providers are not willing to all the time to have their personnel sit through an assessment from their customer's QSA, somebody you didn't engage, and now they're having to answer questions and provide evidence and screenshots and things like that. So not an easy conversation to have. So make sure you're having that conversation early enough in the relationship. The point here: don't go it alone. Be sure to engage experts. That can be experts like a QSA, it can be experts like your peers here in the room. Plenty of resources available to you to make sure that you're understanding the specific third-party service providers you're using and the nested service providers as well, so that, again, you can have a sufficient understanding of the risk and limitations that go along there. Kyle, what about 631?
Well, like everything Brian was saying, for the most part, the requirement there is to look at it annually. But you really should do it more often. And something that we're really big on at LBMC is continuous compliance, working on PCI throughout the year. And that is the same for vendor management. It should be continuous monitoring. Like Brian mentioned, you can use some of those third-party risk monitoring tools. I think those are a really good option to kind of keep the pulse of what's going on with your service providers. But the big one, again, is 631. I feel like this is a requirement that doesn't always get the love it deserves, but it specifically talks about vulnerabilities that could affect your environment. And those vulnerabilities could come from your third parties and your fourth parties. And so if you have a threat intelligence team and you haven't provided them with the list of your third-party service providers, as well as the third-party service providers that are listed in their AOCs, you're doing that threat intelligence team a disservice, because they don't have all the information that they should have to be able to detect and identify those vulnerabilities. And even getting to real time, having conversations, keeping abreast with your service providers is really key. The more you're communicating with them, the more you're paying attention, the less of an impact it's going to be to you if something does happen to them. And I know, everyone likes to take pictures of slides. This is the slide to take a picture of. This is really those key points from everything Brian just talked through. If you need to do something, if you need to go back to your vendor management team, these are the points to hit. Do we maintain a complete and accurate list of all of our third-party service providers? Do we know who our vendors rely on, our fourth and fifth parties? Again, the place to start, grab those attestations of compliance, read through and see who their service providers are. There's your short list for all of your fourth parties, and continue it outward. Are subcontractors explicitly addressed in our contracts, making sure that you're contracting with individuals who make sure their subcontractors, their third parties, are secure, compliant, etc. Have we reviewed and validated attestations, not just collected them? The point of collecting AOCs isn't just like they're Pokemon. It's not to collect them all. It's to review them and understand them, making sure that they're addressing what we need them to address. Have we identified who owns what in a responsibility matrix? Again, like Brian was saying, go to 12.9. If you're having any struggles with your service providers, point them to 12.9 and remind them that's a responsibility they have to help you with that. And are we monitoring at least annually, the third-party service provider status, their compliance status, but really more often than that. Again, doing it continuously and as often as we can is really the right way to go. And so while, like we said earlier, compliant third parties don't equal a secure ecosystem, we can say that solid vendor management can equal a resilient ecosystem. And that's really all we can hope for. We all know that security and compliance, they're not really products, they're processes, but a resilient ecosystem, resilience is something we can achieve so that when things go bump in the night, we can at least be ready for it.
We want to thank you all. Thank you for attending our discussion today. Those of you here in the main hall, those of you joining via live stream, privileged to talk to you. Thank you also for the council for the opportunity. Please do, as Kyle mentioned, stop by our booth. We'd love to hear your stories, share ideas, learn from your experiences, how you interact and manage your relationships with your third parties and these nested parties as well. We hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference, and we look forward to meeting you, and have a great rest of the day, a great evening, and cheers, everybody.